Hannah thought she was finally living her dream, but little did she know that her nightmare was just beginning. She had always wanted her own house, and when she finally found the perfect one, she couldn't believe her luck. It was a charming 2-story home with a lush green lawn and a white picket fence, just like in the movies. But as she stepped through the front door, a sense of unease crept over her, like she was being watched. The first few days in her new home were uneventful, and Hannah spent her time unpacking and getting settled in. She met some of her neighbors, including the man who lived next door, Mr. Wilkins. He was tall and thin with dark hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to follow her every move. One night, as she was going through some old college papers, Hannah stumbled upon an essay she'd written about a notorious serial killer. She had chosen the topic because the case had fascinated her, and she had spent weeks poring over police reports and crime scene photos. As she read over the details, a sickening feeling grew in the pit of her stomach. The killer's name was Jacob Wilson, and he had been at large for years, leaving a trail of victims across several states. The details were gruesome, and Hannah felt like she was reading a horror story. But what made her blood run cold was the similarities in the pictures with the man next door. To her, Mr. Wilkins was Jacob Wilson, without a doubt. Hannah tried to dismiss the thought, thinking that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But as the days went on, she began to notice strange things. Mr. Wilkins would always be outside, staring at her as she went to her car or brought in groceries. Sometimes he would even follow her to the mailbox or linger outside her front door. It was like he was watching her constantly. Hannah's fear began to grow, and she started to feel trapped in her own home. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, scared that Mr. Wilkins would try to break in or attack her. She called the police, but they brushed her off as a lunatic and told her that they couldn't do anything without evidence. One night, as Hannah was lying in bed, she heard a noise outside her window. She crept over and peeked out, and there was Mr. Wilkins staring right at her with those piercing blue eyes. She could see something in them that she had never seen before, something that she couldn't quite name. From that moment on, things got worse. Hannah would hear noises coming from next door at all hours of the night, and the smell of decay seemed to seep through the walls. She knew that she had to get out, but she was too scared to leave her house. It was like Mr. Wilkins was controlling her every move. One day, when she couldn't take it anymore, Hannah mustered up the courage to confront Mr. Wilkins. She told him that she knew who he was and what he had done, but he just stared at her with those cold, emotionless eyes. The next morning, her best friend Sarah stopped by to pick her up for their weekly dance class appointment, and after knocking and calling to no avail, she called the police. When the police arrived, they found Hannah's body lying in her bed. She had been strangled, and there were bruises all over her body. Mr. Wilkins was never seen again. A search of his house led the investigators to discover a graveyard of human remains in his basement. Forensic evidence later linked some of the human remains with the known victims of Jacob Wilson, the serial killer that still remains at large. Story 2. Margaret's House. Lena had been searching for a new home for months and finally found the perfect one. It was a beautiful, spacious 2-story house with a large backyard and a great view of the mountain. Lena moved in with her husband, Mark, and their 2 children, Lucas and Emily. Everything seemed perfect until strange things started to happen. At first, it was small things like doors opening and closing on their own, and strange noises coming from the basement. Lena tried to brush it off as her imagination, but the incidents only grew more frequent and more terrifying. One night, she woke up to find a figure standing at the end of her bed. It was a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing, staring at her with empty eyes. Lena screamed, waking up her family, but when they turned on the lights, the figure vanished. The family started to investigate the history of their new home and discovered that it had once belonged to a woman named Margaret, who had been brutally murdered by her husband in the early 1900s. Lena and her family were convinced that Margaret's spirit was haunting the house, and they tried everything they could think of to get rid of her. They even hired a renowned medium to perform a cleansing, but it only seemed to make things worse. One night, as Lena was putting her children to bed, she heard a voice calling her name from the basement. She followed the voice, and as she descended the stairs, she saw a dark figure standing in the corner. Lena felt a sudden chill, and before she could react, the figure lunged at her, dragging her into the darkness. The next day, Mark and the children found Lena's lifeless body lying at the foot of the basement stairs. The family moved out of the house, but they could never forget the terror they had experienced there. Lena's death was never explained, and the house remained vacant for years, a dark reminder of the horror that had taken place within its walls. Story 3. The Hidden Lair. The Barons family had just moved into their dream home, a charming 2-story house with a spacious backyard for their kids to play. But as they settled in, strange noises started to echo throughout the house, and a feeling of unease began to grow. It wasn't long until they realized that something was lurking beneath the surface. One day, as Mr. Barons was rearranging the basement, he stumbled upon a hidden door covered by some old rugs. Curiosity got the best of him, and he couldn't resist the urge to explore. As he made his way through the dark passage, the musty smell became more intense, and he could hear faint whispers in the distance. Suddenly, he found himself in a dimly lit room filled with stolen goods and tools. The room was deserted, but he could feel eyes watching him. Just as he was about to leave, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Turning around, he saw a group of shady-looking men entering the room. They were a gang of thieves, using the basement as their hideout. Mr. Barons tried to make a run for it, but it was too late. They had spotted him and were determined not to let him leave. They took him hostage and demanded a ransom from his family. Mrs. Barons and their children soon found themselves prisoners in their own home, held captive by ruthless thieves. They were terrorized and abused, and the situation seemed hopeless. But Mrs. Barons refused to give up. She knew that her family's only chance of survival was to find a way out. She gathered all her strength and devised a plan to escape. In the dead of night, Mrs. Barons led her children through the dark halls, avoiding the thieves as best she could. It was a risky move, and they knew they were in grave danger. Suddenly, they heard a loud noise, and Mrs. Barons turned around to see her youngest child, Johnny, had tripped over a loose floorboard. The sound echoed throughout the house, and the thieves were quickly onto them. Mrs. Behrens knew that she had to make a sacrifice. She told her children to run and not look back. She would stay behind and try to fight off the thieves, giving her children a chance to escape. Her children protested, but she was firm. They had to survive, no matter the cost. As her children ran, Mrs. Behrens confronted the thieves. She fought bravely, but it was a losing battle. In the end, none of the Behrens made it out alive. Their bodies were found by the police after the neighbors and the children's school raised complaints of not seeing them in days. Evidence of the struggle was found in the underground passages, along with stolen goods and tools the neighbors had reported missing. To this day, the perpetrators haven't been found.